Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The NVIDIA price action comes after the news the company revealed last night, which is that the U.S. government has put new restrictions on its ability to send its H20 chip to export it to China. The company says this is going to result in a $5.5 billion write-down in the current quarter tied to inventory and previous commitments for the chip. And NVIDIA is not the only one. AMD also expecting a charge of as much as $800 million after the administration put restrictions on it too, specifically its ability to export its MI308 products to China. All of this is the U.S. is trying to restrict China's access to and ability to develop advanced semiconductor technology and the things that technology ultimately powers. So for more, we turn to Ed Ludlow, who is co-host of Bloomberg Technology. Thanks for being here, Ed. Obviously, there were already restrictions in place that companies like NVIDIA were grappling with, but this H20 chip was supposed to be a way to get around the problem of export controls, and now it is, once again, falling victim to controls.
Yeah, that's exactly what both our sort of political and markets audience needs to understand, that the specific technology that is, as of this morning, subject to these additional license requirements was already a result of what the Biden administration had put in place. Like NVIDIA's H20, for example, they designed it in 2023 with the hopes that it would get around, circumvent those restrictions. For NVIDIA, a $5.5 billion write-down, that's literally basically the loss of being unable to sell inventory that was already committed to customers is a pain, but for AMD, even though their dollar sales is much less than NVIDIA, proportionately, China's so important. And the context you need to remember is these are American companies. They are the biggest technology companies in the world. NVIDIA, literally the biggest player in AI markets. And there was a time where China was the most important end market for cloud computing. NVIDIA's already moved away. 2022, China was about 26% of revenue. It's now low double digits, and most people see it going to single digits. But this is the trade-off the administration needs to work with these companies on. They want to onshore them in the US, but need to consider the end markets they're now being cut off from.
Well, yeah, and how that may impact these companies' ability to invest in things like greater capacity in the United States. Are we to assume, Ed, that actually getting licenses to continue exporting these chips is completely out of the question?
Well, I had the opportunity this morning to ask the president's advisor and director of the Office for Science and Technology Policy, Michael Kratsios, and he declined to answer. And the audience can read into that what they will. It was a very specific question. Will you advise the president to allow AMD and NVIDIA to have a license? The point is that these chips are much lower performance than the leading edge product that both of them produce. The concern and anxiety from the White House is that they're still capable of going into an AI supercomputer, and that from a national security perspective, China could use that lower level technology for the things it's concerned about. But again, he declined to comment. It's going to be really interesting to see how they play it. My question to your panel throughout the week and the shows is what happens next, right? Because the thing we haven't talked about is which Chinese companies were buying those chips. Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance. I'd be really curious if America thinks about something called an entity list and goes much more specific on how it prevents the transfer of technology.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions about how much further this could snowball. Ed, to your point about this being kind of a lower capability chip than others, are there still further rungs on the ladder that the administration could decide to go down and restrict exports when it comes to what NVIDIA and AMD make?
Yeah, an entity list is interesting because you basically say, okay, American companies, you cannot sell to these specific Chinese companies. We've listed them for you, but those are the biggest customers. There's another way of thinking about this. The expression, it takes two to tango. And in a trade or tariffs or restrictions environment, think about it from China's perspective. Huawei is becoming their national champion of cutting-edge technology. They have a similar chip that does what NVIDIA and AMD's lower-level chips can do. But those Chinese companies wanted to use the American technology. there is an argument made by some on my show earlier today, Denny Fish, who has billions of dollars of those stocks, that, well, all America is doing inadvertently or indirectly is allowing China to move forward with onshoring and elevating its own domestic industry. So that's a very interesting thing, right? You're cutting off sales of your main American technology companies on the hope that they shift activities to the US and that they have other customers outside of China.
All right. Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Technology, thank you so much. And we want to keep the focus on China and specifically the prospect of trade negotiations opening up between Washington and Beijing, as we learned today some details about what China might be asking for before they're willing to go to the table. And it's to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House, that we turn to for those details. So, Tyler, obviously there's a number of things here based on our reporting. How likely is the administration to acquiesce to what China wants?
Yeah, hey, Kailey. Well, that really remains to be seen, considering that one of the big points here that we're learning per a person familiar with the Chinese government's thinking is that Beijing would like to see a point person appointed to lead these talks other than President Trump. And we know that this White House has repeatedly said that he would be directly involved. And even the president himself has said that he is waiting for Xi Jinping's call. Still, this is kind of our first insight that we've really seen into potentially what could break what has been weeks of escalation between the two countries. Also importantly, the source familiar telling Bloomberg News that the most important precondition is going to be for Chinese officials to feel that they are treated with respect. It appears that Beijing would like to see President Trump start to disavow when his cabinet members, for example, criticize China, even if President Trump himself says that he has a good relationship with Xi Jinping. So far, we have to see where this goes, because we do know that the White House would like China to ultimately reach out directly. And we should say that that tactic has helped expedite negotiations in some cases. Take today, for example. Japan is here with negotiators in Washington, and Japan was one of those countries that did reach out directly to President Trump with a phone call between the Prime Minister and the White House. And officials have repeatedly pointed us to the fact that Japan would get priority status because they felt that they reached out very quickly to negotiate. And while we talk about who is talking and who's not talking, we have to always keep in mind, of course, Japan, but also those other countries like South Korea and Vietnam, geographically close to China, that this White House seems to be prioritizing in calls as Xi Jinping completes his own tour of Southeast Asia countries as he tries to talk to those leaders directly to shore up his support.
Yeah, and Bloomberg has some fresh reporting out today, Tyler, about how the administration may be asking countries like Japan to be considering putting their own tariffs on China as part of these negotiations. What other asks could the Japanese who are in Washington today face from the administration?
Right, and that reporting is particularly interesting because Bloomberg News had actually reported that a few months ago. Remember when those Mexico tariff talks were underway, that the U.S. had been pressuring Mexico to lift its own tariffs against China. So this does appear to be a repeat of a potential strategy here by the administration, as we've heard Scott Bessent, for example, say that he would like to see a coalition form together, and then they could tackle ultimately what happens there with China. It remains to be seen exactly what's going to be put on the table when it comes to these talks with Japan. President Trump, of course, saying in his Truth Social post that they'll be talking about trade imbalances as well as American military support. As you well know, all of these talks are going well beyond just those tariff barriers. We could keep in mind that Japan has already pledged, for example, that it would boost U.S. LNG imports into the country. So perhaps that could be one of the factors here on the table as we wait to learn more. But one thing that we do know, Kailey, President Trump says he's going to be directly involved in these talks today, even though they're not at the leader level. He's going to appear alongside his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much for your reporting. And now we get analysis from our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, both of them Bloomberg politics contributors. Rick, also Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, when we consider these negotiations that are now beginning, knowing that there is a 90-day window that is getting ever shorter that the administration has left for itself here to ink all of these various trade deals, how important is it for them to have quick victories, quick deals to announce?
You know, I don't think it's really that critical for them to have a lot of quick deals, show momentum. I mean, maybe if they're trying to, regain some of the footing that's lost in the markets, that would make some sense. But I think really this is a much bigger thing, and I think your conversation with Tyler kind of kicks it off, and that is this is about isolating China, right? You'll notice everybody else got a reprieve but them. This has been a real focus of Donald Trump since his first presidency, is to basically divide the world along the lines of they're friends of China and they're friends of the United States. And we haven't seen this kind of alignment since the Soviet Union, sphere of influence strategies that the U.S. used to have to go through during the Cold War. And so at the end of the day, I think what you see is this decoupling. You see trying to isolate China. You see the use of the military in the Pacific. You see the use of diplomacy abroad. You see the use of economics at home and abroad. And I think these are all the toolkits that Trump's using to try and basically create a deterrent to Chinese influence around the world.
Well, but he still says he wants China to pick up the phone and call. He'd like to make a deal, is the contention of him and others in the White House. Jeannie, and Tyler was just outlining some of the things China, according to our reporting, wants to see first. Guarantees that they'll be respected. There will be one point person, that there will be consistency in U.S. policy. Do you see those things as likely to be delivered by the Trump administration?
We haven't seen a sign of it yet. You know, Donald Trump has famously described himself as a great deal maker, and yet on the very issues he needs to make deals so far in the last 80 days, he has fallen short. Now, granted, we have to give him some time. But, you know, as I'm listening to Rick, I'm thinking that may have all been true for Donald Trump 1.0. But in Donald Trump 2.0, if we are trying to decouple from China, if we are trying to isolate China, we are doing a heck of a job doing that. Why the tariffs on every country in the world? Why start with Canada and Mexico? Why drive so many of our allies to seek relationships with China? Why is Xi Jinping traveling around the world right now, shoring up those relationships? So if that was the intent, and I actually agree with the intent, then it is a heck of a way to roll out that policy. And I think that's the problem here. There was a smart way to do targeted tariffs on China to get where we need to go, and we do need to get there. But this is not the way. And so now Donald Trump is caught up in trying to negotiate with every country around the world, as opposed to focusing like a laser beam where we should be focused, which is on China.
Well, he obviously was not shy about talking about China on the campaign trail, which is how we got to Trump 2.0, Rick, is in part because he campaigned on this. But he also campaigned on just the idea that he thinks tariffs are the way to revive the American manufacturing economy and make the U.S. greater than it was before. Can we quantify the actual domestic support for any of these policies, whether it comes to China or the wider tariff regime that is in place?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're right. It's not just a weapon or a tool of diplomacy and foreign relations. It's a way, in Donald Trump's mind, that you take off pressures from taxation on the American public and allow the world to fund our country and our government. And so he hasn't really invested too heavily in selling that. Obviously, it was a big part of his campaign. But you'll notice that most of the tariff discussion has not been as a way of avoiding taxing our citizens in his rhetoric up until this point in time. And I would say without that, the American public is basically seeing, and we're seeing it in the consumer surveys and the polling, that they don't like it very much. It's destabilizing the economy. They are very pessimistic about the future. They think it'll help increase inflation. I mean, basically all the detractors who have been anti-tariffs have been seemingly getting through to these consumers and voters much more clearly than Donald Trump has.
Well, and you're starting to see that showing up in town halls, or arguably we've already been seeing it. But take the example of Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, Jeannie, who just got an earful, although he already was kind of skeptical of tariffs. He was one of the co-sponsors of that bipartisan legislation that would reassert Congress's authority over the matter, that got a veto threat from the White House already. But for the others in Congress who are at home in their districts right now for their Easter recess, do you expect they could return to Washington, D.C. on the other side of it with a different attitude when it comes to tariffs?
Absolutely, because they will be talking to constituents who are hurt by this tariff taxation plan that the president has put into place. You know, the president is sitting in the Oval Office saying, Well, I like Tim Cook. I just talked to Tim Cook. I made an exception for Tim Cook. But these representatives and senators will be talking to their constituents, big and small business owners, people who have jobs that rely on trade and free trade around the world. And the way the president has gone about this is reckless. And we're seeing it, as Rick said, in the consumer confidence. We're seeing it in the polls. And the president has yet to explain what the goal is. If the goal is to reshore and build manufacturing, exemptions work in the opposite direction. Why the exemptions, right? If the goal is to raise revenue, why the exemptions, right? So he not only has done this in a reckless way, he has been unable to articulate the goal, and he has been unable to articulate how long this pain will be felt by the American public. Congressmen and women will hear all of that over break, and they may return saying we need to claim back some of our power. Although it's Congress, Kailey, so I wouldn't hold my bet they'll do anything right away.
Fair enough. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our political panel. Thank you.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington, where there is a Japanese delegation also today, specifically here to meet with members of the administration and, according to President Trump, the president himself. All of this, of course, about trade. President Trump posting on Truth Social earlier today, Japan is coming in today to negotiate tariffs, the cost of military support, and this is in capitals and quotes, trade fairness. He says, I will attend the meeting along with the Treasury and Commerce secretaries. Hopefully something can be worked out, which is good, great for Japan and the USA. So we want to get more on this now with Nancy Cook, Bloomberg senior national political correspondent. Nancy, we've known that the U.S. was really prioritizing Japan in this series of trade negotiations with many different countries that have yet to unfold. I believe it was the first country we actually heard Secretary Bessent say they're opening formal conversations with. What exactly will the objective be when it comes to Japan specifically?
Well, I think that a big thing that the administration is trying to do is, come up with trade deals with each individual country. And part of those trade deals involve sort of lessening the trade imbalance that the U.S. has with any other country. But a big part of the negotiations, I'm told by White House officials, is also sort of making sure that the other countries have some criteria to also impose potentially secondary tariffs on China. So as part of those negotiations, it's not just that they want sort of a better deal with Japan, let's say in the US, they also want Japan to take some sort of measures towards China. And they're going to be asking that, the administration is going to be asking that of a lot of the countries that they negotiate with. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that goes, because this is sort of going to be one of the first negotiations that we really see out in the open.
Well, so is that just all in an attempt to gain more leverage for when negotiations with China eventually open? Because Bloomberg's reporting is indicating today there's a number of steps China would like to see this administration take before they're willing to begin those talks.
Of course. I mean, I think China does not want to be embarrassed by the situation, and they want a bunch of steps. They want initial contact. They want to feel like there's going to be a measure of respect when President Xi and President Trump finally do speak sort of leader to leader. And that is sort of their way of doing things. But meanwhile, what the U.S. government is trying to do is really sort of create new alliances and make sure that our trading partners, our key trading partners like Japan, are also sort of trying to decouple from China a little bit as well.
So how does that impact the timeline? Because China also, Xi Jinping has been fanning out across parts of Asia to ink trade deals with countries like Vietnam, for example, to counter U.S. tariffs. Does that kind of escalate the speed with which the administration wants to make sure to move to get some of these deals actually inked?
Well, I think the administration is trying to move quickly to cut these deals on a number of fronts, because they just put things on a 90-day pause. And so they have sort of their own self-imposed deadline. We have seen President Trump, I've covered him for many years. We have seen him change those deadlines and move things forward. But I think it's going to be like a race between China and the U.S. about sort of who can cut deals with different countries and what that level of diplomacy looks like.
And no deal is going to be cut without President Trump's direct sign-off, right? He's in these talks in addition to Lutnick and Bessent. This is not letting kind of members of the cabinet do things. He is intimately involved in this process.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he is the one really calling the shots on the tariffs. I think that there is, there has been some disagreement among the top economic advisors about what the tariffs should look like, how sort of extreme they should be, how nuanced they should be. But he is always in the driver's seat on making those decisions.
I'd like to ask you about something else pertaining to the administration that has been capturing a lot of news coverage, certainly, and that is the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. After we earlier this week saw the president of El Salvador visiting the White House. This is, of course, a man who was wrongly deported to El Salvador, is currently imprisoned there. The administration says it's up to Bukele if he wants to return him, but Bukele says no, even though the Supreme Court said this must be facilitated. But there is no sign that the administration is shifting its even tone on this. If anything, Nancy, they're quadrupling down, it seems.
Yeah, what I have been so struck by just throughout Trump's second term so far, and we're not even at the 100-day mark, is that they are not super concerned about following the norms or necessarily the checks and balances that the court system imposes. And I think this is just another instance of them thinking, well, we'll defy the Supreme Court if we want. Like, what is in it for us? What is going to be the consequence? Republicans on Capitol Hill, have really made very little public noise about what Trump has done. And I think it's another example of the administration sort of testing the boundaries of law and what is going to be legally permissible.
All right, Bloomberg's Nancy Cook, senior national political reporter for us here in Washington. Thank you so much. And we want to dig further into the Abrego Garcia case and issues of immigration with this administration further now with an immigration attorney. David Leopold is joining me. He's group leader in immigration at UB Greensfelder and also former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, who's going to be joining me in a minute as we consider Abrego Garcia's case, which of course has captured enough attention that a senator from Maryland, the Democrat Chris Van Hollen, has actually made tracks to El Salvador himself today to try to see him in prison as he continues to plead his case. We heard from the senator as he was ready to board the plane at Dulles earlier.
My overall purpose here is to send a signal that we are not going to stop fighting for his return until he is actually released. I may be the first senator or first member of Congress to go down to El Salvador, but people are going to keep on coming until he comes home. This is about the rule of law. This is about due process. This is about not letting people be just whisked off the street, which the Trump administration admits was done in error. And I just want people to think about what that means.
So let's get David Leopold's take on the rule of law here. He is joining me now. David, really appreciate the time. Obviously, the Supreme Court had ruled that the administration needed to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia, but did they leave just too much room for interpretation? Is there gray area here that you see the administration taking advantage of, or they're just literally flouting the courts?
They're clearly flouting the courts. Look, if it had gone the other way, right? If you had a Supreme Court telling the Trump administration to facilitate the deportation of somebody, do you think there'd be any misunderstanding to that usage of the term? They're clearly an open defiance of not only the district court, but of the Supreme Court of the United States. And as Senator Van Hollen just said, this is about the rule of law, and the rule of law affects us all. So whereas, this is a focus obviously on an immigration issue and a removal, an improper and illegal removal to a hellhole prison in El Salvador, this affects all of us. This affects everyone. The through line is to U.S. citizens and Americans.
But specifically, Abrego Garcia is not a U.S. citizen, which the administration has been very quick to point out whenever this is raised, that he actually came illegally from El Salvador, and it is to El Salvador where he was returned, even though a court had ruled he should not be deported to El Salvador, specifically because of threats he faced there. Does that indicate, though, David, that even if he were to be brought back to the U.S. from the prison where he currently is, that he could very easily just deported and sent literally anywhere else beyond El Salvador?
Well, let's remember why he was in the United States. That's because the Trump administration in 2019 found that he was facing a threat to his life or his liberty if he was sent to El Salvador. This was in 2019, and this was in an immigration court. What is an immigration court? It's an agency of the Department of Justice. It's not an Article III court. It's an agency of the Department of Justice. So the Trump administration itself after extensive vetting of criminal background, after extensive vetting of public safety risks, etc., found that Mr. Abrego Garcia would suffer a loss to his liberty or his life if he was sent back to El Salvador. So for them to now come out and use this increasingly hostile and hateful rhetoric, going from "we made a mistake" to now "he's a terrorist," is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. So if he's brought back to the United States, he would be restored to the status that he was in, and that's as a lawfully present non-citizen in the United States under what we call withholding of removal because he faces a loss of liberty or life in El Salvador. That's why this part of it, the whole thing is horrible, but that makes it particularly horrible.
Well, and that is just the case of this one man who was on planes that were full of hundreds of people who were deported and sent to this prison. And of course, the very nature of whether or not those planes ultimately should have landed in El Salvador was in question in the case being overseen by Judge Boasberg, who today said he sees reason to hold administration officials in contempt for violating his verbal order to turn the planes around. I feel free to weigh in on whether that contempt kind of proceeding will change anything here. But what about due process for those individuals who are on board those aircraft?
What about due process? I mean, the fairness of this, there is no fairness. Due process really means fairness. It means an opportunity to present yourself to a court. It means an opportunity to tell the government, no, you know what, I'm not supposed to be part of this, and here's why. And nobody who was sent, the people that were sent to El Salvador, to the Sicat prison, the notoriously brutal prison run by the two-bit dictator Bukele from El Salvador, those folks, they didn't get any chance to defend themselves. And we see that mistakes were made, whether it was the barber or whether it was the women who were sent down there. We see that mistakes were made, and we see that mistakes can be corrected. What's going on here is that the government, the Trump administration, is doubling down and does not want to follow the courts. There's an open defiance of the United States Supreme Court, playing with words like effectuate. We all know what that means. It means get him home, for God's sake. That's what the district court said, and that's what the Supreme Court affirmed. And you think of this horrible rhetoric that's coming out of the Oval Office about him being a terrorist, and remind people that you can lie in the Oval Office, but you can't lie in a courtroom. And so you don't hear that same rhetoric from the DOJ, the Department of Justice attorneys who are arguing these cases. They're hemming and hawing for sure, but they all have ethical duties to present good faith arguments to the court, and you're not hearing that hateful those name calling and that sort of thing from the attorneys.
David, we just have 30 seconds left, but if any of those attorneys or others were to be held in contempt of court, is there anything President Trump can do to interfere in that?
Well, there's certainly, I would hope not. I would hope that the president would respect the rule of law. I mean, clearly we've seen indications that is not to be expected with the pardon of the January 6th insurrection.
Good point. David Leopold, immigration attorney here on Balance of Power. Thank you for joining Bloomberg.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.